Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick. Thank you so much for joining us for our 32nd consecutive week of extraordinary programs presented by Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc. We are thrilled tonight to welcome back two favorites, the very special Ron Brownstein and the illustrious Larry Mantle, for a conversation entitled, "Is It Over Yet? Election 2020. Maybe they'll tell us it is. I welcome you on behalf of our leadership, Zev Yaroslavsky, Mel Levine, Caroline Kelly, Rabbi Ken Chazen, and David Lehrer, the leadership team of Jews United and Community Advocates, Inc., the creators of this series. Thank you to our many wonderful co-sponsors, Temple Isaiah, Stephen Wise Temple, Valley Beth Shalom, Temple Beth Am, Leo Beck Temple, ECAR, Temple Israel of Hollywood, Jewish Center for Justice, the Holocaust Museum LA, and the Pico Union Project. Please stay with us to the end, and you will hear from David Lehrer about two very exciting programs we've just added to our 2020 year-end lineup. A few weeks ago, during one of our programs, we took a poll, you might remember that, and we received more than 2,500 responses during those few minutes that we offered the poll, and we wanted to share with you just a couple of the responses. In response to where those 2,500 people live, 57% live in California, 18% live on the East Coast, 7% live in the south of the United States, 7% on the West Coast, non-California West Coast, 6% in the Midwest, 2% in the Mountain States, and 2% international. So welcome to you all. And if we didn't mention it, you can, where you are from, you can put it in the Q&A if you'd like. And then we asked a question, would you attend and judge one of these programs at 5 p.m. on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving? And 83% of you said yes. And that's very good because next week's program is the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving. And we are very excited that at least 83% of you will be here as we host George Will and listen to what he has to say. Thank you to all of our audience members who have been so thoughtful and generous, both in terms of your donations and in terms of your feedback about this series. As we were all volunteers working on this series, the feedback has special meaning. And today we received just a really lovely note from one of our esteemed audience members. I wanted to share the content with you. Your America at a Crossroads series has provided not only insightful information, but needed perspective and sorely needed inspiration. Wednesday at 5 p.m. has become an inviolate time block. Continuation of the programs beyond the election and beyond the inauguration will be a valuable public service in a time of ongoing crisis. I hope that will be possible. I can only hope that the enormous effort you have made is partially repaid by the impact of the programs on the ever-increasing number of thought leaders who participate each week. Thank you so much. And we are all buoyed by that note, and we hope that it expresses the opinion of many of you who send us really lovely notes as well. Meanwhile, because this lecture series was created because of COVID-19, we are mindful that today we hit what all Americans should see as a devastating milestone. As of today, 250,000 Americans have died from COVID-19 over the past many months. Our hearts go out to those who have lost loved ones, and we thank all of those doctors, nurses, caregivers, and everyone else who serves on the front lines in caring for those afflicted. This year's Thanksgiving will be very different in so many ways, especially for those who have lost family members to this disease. I am sure that you all wear masks and practice social distancing. If only everyone in the country did so, many fewer would die. As Dr. Fauci said this week, there is great promise from the news about the vaccines. We now see that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but we must continue to practice masking and distancing to save lives, even though a vaccine is on the horizon. Most of all, our deepest sympathies to those who have lost loved ones and our gratitude to those who continue to care for the sick. Now, to further introduce our speakers tonight, please welcome my friend, Judge Leadership Team member, legendary LA City and County Legislator for decades, author, and now professor at his beloved UCLA, Zev Yaroslavsky.
Thank you, Janice, and let me add my welcome to our incredible audience in these very tumultuous days for our democracy. Tonight, we are again honored to have Ron Brownstein as our guest speaker. On September 9th, Ron gave us a tour de force as the presidential campaign was heading into the home stretch. His analysis was thorough and prescient. We look forward to hearing his thoughts on the transition and beyond tonight. Ron is a senior editor for The Atlantic and a senior political analyst at CNN. He writes a weekly column for each and is frequently seen on cable news. He has a long and distinguished journalistic career, coordinating political coverage for The Atlantic and the National Journal. He has been a regular columnist for the Los Angeles Times and has frequently appeared on Meet the Press, This Week with George Stephanopoulos, Face the Nation, PBS's Washington Week in Review, among others. His work has been published in virtually every major publication in American journalism. In addition to all that, Ron has authored 6 books, and his 7th book, Rock on the Water, A History of Politics and Culture in LA in the 1970s, will be published and released early next year. Ron Brownstein is widely considered one of the most knowledgeable and influential journalists in our nation today. None other than President Bill Clinton, when asked to name the one journalist who generally gets it right, responded that the person is Ron Brownstein. We are delighted that he has accepted our invitation for return engagement tonight. To engage him in conversation, we are honored to have Larry Mantle back with us. For those of us in Los Angeles, Larry needs no introduction. He has been the host of Air Talk on NPR's KPCC since for 30 years. Air Talk is the longest running daily talk show in Southern California. He is known for his kind yet probing and incisive interview style. A 4th generation Angelino, Larry has interviewed thousands of prominent guests on an extraordinary array of topics and received many journalistic awards in the process, including a Golden Mike, an Associated Press honor, and he was recognized by the Los Angeles Press Club under the Best Talk Show category. Welcome back to our America at Crossroads series, Larry, and I turn it over to you and Ron.
Zev, thank you so much. It's a wonderful pleasure to be back here again for one of these very important conversations as part of the series that judge and community advocates have put together. I know I've learned so much from them, just watching them as a member of the audience, and to be able to participate and conduct the interviews is a real pleasure and an honor. I also, Zev, want to thank you, because over all these years, the many times you've joined us on the program and provided your expertise has been invaluable. So always a deep appreciation of all the service you've provided our city and our county, and thank you so much. It's a pleasure to get this opportunity to talk with Ron Brownstein, because the topics revolving around the election, of course, have been the daily focus of our program Air Talk on KPCC. And like everyone else, we've been trying to discern from the election results what sorts of changes are taking place in the country, demographically, attitudinally, culturally, and how this is playing out in the form of what we're seeing in the vote count from around the country. But Ron, I want to begin, instead of looking back at the what happened during the election. We'll have plenty of time to get to that. I actually want to look forward, and I want to look at this transition that isn't yet a formal transition. Where are we headed with this, with a president who has not conceded defeat and a president-elect who's in the process of assembling his team?
Yeah, well, first of all, great to be here with you, Larry, and Zev. Thank you for inviting me back, and glad to see everyone virtually. Look, I think that there is no indication that Trump is going to concede the election. He probably will not even concede the election after the Electoral College, ratifies Joe Biden as the winner. And there is very little willingness of Republicans to put any pressure on him to participate in the transition, even at the price, as Biden keeps saying every day now, of potentially disrupting the rollout of the vaccine. It's just extraordinary. I mean, you would say it is extraordinary to watch this deference to Trump given the consequences, except it's not extraordinary. It's just kind of a continuation of what we have seen for 4 years. As I like to say, every time he breaks a window, the congressional Republicans obediently sweep up the glass. I mean, we keep waiting for this moment where they say enough, and it never comes. And it may never come going forward in ways that we're going to talk about. Look, Biden, has invested a great deal in this idea that he's going to be the president of all of America and that he's going to bring us all together. And as you can see, he has been incredibly focused on turning the other cheek, not criticizing the Republicans, kind of laughing at their posture and saying he will work with them later. Really, not even really criticizing Trump that hard, just saying it's an embarrassment to him, to Trump personally, rather than an impediment to Biden. So I honestly don't know how long they can let this go, but they do seem to be willing to give it some more rope.
Well, and speak a little bit, if you will, the political downside of Republican leaders taking on the president directly now and saying, Mr. President, it's very clear that you've lost. It's not close enough in these states where you're challenging that things are likely to turn. So let's say gets angry at them, tweets against them, which is the likely outcome from them making their plea. If he's not president anymore, what sort of power does he have over them?
That's interesting. I have a long piece in the Atlantic tomorrow, really, on this very subject. Look, I think the feeling among Republicans is on multiple factors. One is, why poke the bear? Eventually the process is going to play itself out. He's going to leave. Why get in a fight with him, especially when we need him to activate his non-urban base in Georgia for the special elections in January. Second, I think, there are Republicans who, and obviously now it seems more and more implausible each day, but let's face it, there are Republicans who'd be perfectly happy if he could find a way to steal the election. Would not have a big moral scruple about him finding, if he could have found the levers somehow with state legislators or judges to do this. I'm not sure Mitch McConnell would have thrown himself on the pyre to defend American democracy. And third, I think that for the kind of the hardcore, they recognize that what Trump is doing is delegitimizing Biden, at least in the eyes of their own voters, which will make it harder for Republicans to cross the line and work with him on almost anything when he takes office. There's a poll out today from Monmouth University. 77% of Trump voters believe that the election was stolen from him. Just kind of a staggering reminder of how different a reality we can be living in this country. But there is, Larry, a price to all of this, because if you allow Trump to exit the White House claiming that the election was stolen from him and that he really won, it is really hard at that point to generate any momentum in the party for a reconsideration of his direction. All of those Republicans who have felt that Trump is leading them into a cul-de-sac demographically and culturally and economically. If he leaves basically saying, well, there was really nothing wrong with the way, there was nothing wrong with my message or agenda or persona. The only reason I lost is because it was stolen from me. And 3/4 of Republican voters agree that it was stolen from him. They are basically reinforcing his position, his dominant position in the party. And he, I think, is clearly more interested than Al Gore or John Kerry or John McCain or Hillary Clinton at using that to intimidate and influence the way they interact with the next president.
But looking ahead to 2024, and whoever the candidate is going to be that emerges from the Republican field, but let's say it's a Nikki Haley or a Marco Rubio or someone like that who emerges. This is all going to be put on replay, how they handled the point of this transition.
Yes.
So if the party to win demographically going forward has to win more suburban voters than they did this time out, then is there not an upside for a Haley or a Rubio or others like that to come out and say, hey, this hand is played out, you've lost, Mr. President, we move forward?
Well, first of all, it is not at all guaranteed that Donald Trump won't run again. He can run again. And you have to think that in the end, he'll be 78 years old. We do have some precedent for that in this year, but in the end, you kind of bet that he wouldn't run again, but I bet he dangles the possibility of running again until the last possible minute. I remember when Mario Cuomo had a plane on the runway in December 1991 to take him to New Hampshire on the final day for filing before he decided not to do it. I think Donald Trump is going to be the same. I think he has every incentive, even if he doesn't, some people say he'll announce right away, as soon as he leaves the White House. Even if he doesn't do that, I think he has every incentive in terms of ensuring more attention to him and also giving him more leverage over the party to dangle the possibility and until the very last minute. And I think Republicans I can tell you from talking to some just this week, they are flummoxed about how to deal with this. If you're thinking about running in 2024, how do you begin to suggest any change in direction after an election, as you rightly point out, as we'll talk about, that saw enormous suburban consolidation against Republicans, and saw Trump lose by more than 6 million votes. There's an argument that they need a different direction to win a national campaign. It's going to be awful hard if he's just kind of sitting there like one of the Macy's parade blimps, kind of looming over the party.
Well, and whoever the candidate is, if it's not Trump, if that candidate is afraid of offending him and doesn't speak up to some of the things that he's liable to tweet or say during the course of the intervening years, then how do they pull that back in the general election and be able to deal with that if they've got the former president at that time at odds with him? And that's a very narrow needle to thread.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm reminded of the quote that was attributed to Nancy Reagan after the 1988 Republican convention, when she supposedly said, "Kinder and gentler than whom?" And, that was her response to Bush subtly differentiating himself from Reagan. Imagine what it's going to be like if anyone goes out and says Republicans have to be more welcoming of immigrants, or what in any way in which you suggest a deviation from Trumpism. He's going to be like Zeus with thunderbolts coming at you. And it's not clear to me that any of them have figured out a way to deal with that, especially given the fact that he added 10 million more votes in 2020 than 2016. And the evidence is pretty clear that he did improve with Hispanic and African-American voters, especially the former, from 2016. So his ability to constrain debate in the party is substantial to begin with. And I think it only gets greater if they allow him to perpetuate this, stab in the back theory that he didn't really lose, it was stolen from him.
Ron, let's talk about those specifics. What we saw in the shift demographically in the election, particularly in the suburbs, the racial and ethnic moves that we saw in different states, and how that's going to be affecting the position of both parties. Because as you've observed, this is a challenge we talked about the Republicans, this is a big challenge for the Democrats, given the results they saw.
Yeah. I've described this as the Antietam election, which left both sides bloodied without anything approaching a resolution of their underlying conflict. There's a lot for each side to be concerned about in what happened here. I mean, Larry, I think we saw in a broad sense a lot of things we expected, and then we saw some things we didn't expect. I mean, the basic thing that we saw that we expected was this widening trench between metro and non-metro America. And we can go through the numbers later if you want, but Biden consolidated metro America to a remarkable degree. I mean, much further than even Clinton in 2016. He won at least 91 of the 100 largest counties in America. And while the margins, interestingly, were, compressed in some of the major cities, urban centers, because of evidence, as I said, that Trump did a little better among Hispanic and African-American men in particular, the suburban numbers were unimaginable. I mean, he won the 4 suburban counties outside of Philadelphia by 275,000 votes, 100,000 more than Clinton won them by 4 years ago, 150,000 more than Obama. He won Denver and the suburban counties around it by 175,000 more votes. Cobb and Gwinnett, Obama lost them. Clinton narrowly won them. Stacey Abrams won them by a little more. In 2018, Biden blew the doors off. And that's how he has apparently won the state. So that happened. The other side, Trump maintained his strength in Trump country. I mean, there was some of the mid-sized industrial cities in the Rust Belt, Erie, Scranton, the Green Bay area, where Biden did a little better. But by and large, he didn't really crack that citadel very much. And certainly in small town, Trump once again turned out more voters than any of the polls expected, particularly in the Rust Belt states. I mean, there's clearly something about his ability to bring in people who are not turning up in polls in the Rust Belt states, not so much in the Sun Belt. I think the polling was a lot better there, but in the Rust Belt, no one had Wisconsin as a half-point race. So that was all pretty much as expected. I think the big surprise was that we saw more split ticket voting on one side of this divide than on the other. I mean, Republican candidates benefited, I think, uniformly from the huge small town, rural, and exurban turnout that Trump, instigated. But if you look inside the metros, I think it's pretty clear. And Orange County is a good place.
Yeah, Orange County is good.
Orange County. I mean, Biden won Orange County by more than Hillary Clinton did, and Republicans won two House seats. I think there's some evidence that there were a fair number, and if you look at the Senate races in North Carolina or Georgia, I think there's some evidence that there were a reasonable number of voters inside the metros, white collar voters, probably many of them white voters, who voted for Biden because they just had it with Trump, everything about him, the volatility, the incompetence, the racism, but were unwilling to give Democrats a free hand and voted for Republican down ballot. I mean, I wasn't surprised that Democrats lost most of the House seats. The Democrats lost in this year. You could have predicted they would lose. They were places on the very far frontier of their coalition, and hard to hold with Trump actually on the ballot. But I think most people who do this for a living, like my friend David Wasserman or other folks at Cook or Stu Rothenberg, they predicted the Democrats would offset those losses by winning even more seats in suburbia, in places they didn't get in 2018, like the suburbs of Indianapolis and Cincinnati, and further seats in Texas. That didn't happen. Those voters held back and would not give Democrats a vote down ballot, even if they voted for Biden.
So that seems to me a distinct anti-Trump effect, and that you talked about the consolidation in the Rust Belt that Trump experienced, and he ran very distinctly against progressive Democrats, and the threat that Biden was essentially a Trojan horse for progressivism to come in, and that essentially the politics of the squad is what you would see if Biden is elected. Given what we see in Congress, did that message connect in a way that the president himself didn't connect?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's exactly what happened. Someone said to me the other day, he has a right to be pissed off because he branded the Democrats and drove up his turnout in a way that both made it possible for Republicans to achieve a lot of gains in the House, but couldn't benefit from that himself because he had become so personally toxic to many of those suburban voters. And look, that's where the movement was. Biden recovered a little ground among non-college white women. And obviously he benefited from a consolidation among young voters, many of whom splintered off to the third parties last time. If you look at non-white voters, both exit polls, and neither one are perfect. There are lots of problems with the exit polls this year, but both of them say that Trump ran better among Asian Americans, Hispanics, and African Americans than he did last time. The big movement were those college whites, including the men, not only the women. The women may not have moved that much from 2018. The men, I think, continue to move against him. But clearly some of those voters accepted the message that Democrats were, extreme or ideological. And if you gave them the keys, they would drive too fast and, kind of take the country off the cliff. So that is the challenge, I think, in Georgia in this special election, because you could imagine, even if there are voters who are willing to vote for Warnock over Loeffler, because they might think she's a zero and she's ethically challenged and she hasn't really shown much, and they feel good about voting for an African American senator from the Deep South. I could see there being a fair number of voters who reach that conclusion. Will they take the second step and vote for Ossoff over Perdue, and in effect, knowing that vote gives Chuck Schumer the majority and gives Biden unified control? I think that's going to be really hard.
Yeah, Ron, you live in all the complexities of this, and I love that. To me, someone a little bit more at a distance, I see broad strokes that do seem highly influential to me. And the first debate and Trump's behavior in running roughshod over that debate, over Chris Wallace, over Biden. I know it's hard to reduce 4 years to a moment and say it's pivotal, but I sensed in that aftermath of the debate that was sort of his last chance to hold on to those suburban whites who wanted to vote for him. And after that, many of them just couldn't.
I agree with that. I mean, the way you phrased it, I mean, I don't think it convinced those suburban whites not to vote for him. I think they were already inclined not to do so. And that was an opportunity for him to kind of possibly cause them to give him a second look. I mean, I'm not sure a better performance would have done that, but it's pretty clear that what he did caused them to reaffirm their decision and ended his conversation with those voters. You know, I think there was always a sense, I mean, I at least always had the sense that after both debates, he would basically go around the country saying Democrats are godless socialists, and he would pull back some Republican leaning voters, and even more that he would kind of, once he got out of the debate context and could kind of go to the red meat, he would again gin up turnout. I mean, that is his superpower. I mean, he does have a political superpower of turning out more non-college and non-urban whites than anybody thinks is possible. And, you know, one issue Republicans will have going forward, we talked about the suburban problem. You know, if he is the face of the party, well, if he's not the face of the party, can you get those elevated levels of turnout in the future among those voters? They couldn't really do it in 2018 when he wasn't on the ballot. So, you know, it's possible that in 2022 and 2024, we'll see a little bit of a reversion to the mean on both sides, Larry. I mean, we could see the Democratic margins, Democratic improvement receding somewhat in the suburbs, particularly in the Sun Belt, without Trump as the face of the Republican Party. But you could also see the rural and non-college white turnout kind of roll back a little without him as the face of the Republican Party.
What do you make of the increased support, albeit a distinct minority, of Black and Latino voters who moved to President Trump? Is some of that the evangelical religious vote that we saw that continued to be rather loyal to the president? Or is there something more than that going on?
You know, I think this is really a critical question for Democrats, and there are a lot of different strains to it. First, you know, as in 2004, when Bush ran quite well among Hispanics overall, he did run much better among Hispanic Protestants than Hispanic Catholics. And I'm assuming because most of the I think most of the Hispanic Protestants are evangelicals. And I'm assuming that was a factor. Again, I mean, there is a big culturally conservative, audience among in Hispanic communities. But I actually, and there's also, there's also a belief among pollsters who study those communities, Hispanic pollsters and African-American pollsters, that Trump's style, his swagger, his belligerence, his, don't mess with me kind of, affectation, had an appeal to men in both communities. But I actually think the piece that's gotten the least attention and is probably, and then of course South Florida is different. There it's socialism and kind of
Cuban American vote.
Yeah, putting that tire around the neck of the Democrats. But I think the part that's not getting enough attention is the economics and COVID. Even though both the African American and Hispanic community are disproportionately affected by the public health aspects of this, I think Trump's just kind of insistence we have to open up no matter what found an audience, particularly among Hispanics, and maybe a surprising audience given how badly the community has been hurt by what's happening. But when you kind of look at you look at how bad the outbreak is in the Valley, the Rio Grande Valley, and how well he did there, basically saying open up, open up, open up. I think that was part of it. Now again, is this something Republicans can build on? I mean, can they move their Hispanic numbers back up into the mid to high 30s, which is where Bush was, as opposed to the 20s, high 20s, where Romney and Trump were? I mean, that's a different world. I mean, and also, it did vary a lot from place to place. Like Arizona wasn't nearly as bad, but again, in Nevada, to give some credence to my theory, pretty clear evidence that in Las Vegas, Trump did better in Hispanic precincts, and clearly there it was open up.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, because Latinos are overrepresented statistically in service industry jobs. So closure. So if they're working, they're at greater risk. If things are shut down, they're not making any way to support the family.
Right. No, it's certainly a Hobson's choice. Now, the thing that we should talk about is that, you can look at all of these dynamics. And as I said before, it is very plausible for Trump to argue. It is harder for the Trump critics inside the Republican Party now to argue this is a dead end. I mean, in fact, there's lots of reason to believe that it would have enormous trouble Trump himself or Trumpism would have enormous trouble winning a presidential election in 2024. I mean, he performed very poorly among young people, and their share of the electorate is only growing. Millennials and Generation Z will be a bigger share of the vote in 24 than they were in 20. He performed very poorly, as we're saying, in the metro areas, and population growth and job growth continues to be centered in the metro areas. And the non-college whites that he relies on do shrink every 4 years as a share of the vote. I mean, he is going to lose the popular vote by over 6 million. I mean, Biden's going to win the popular vote by more than Obama did in 12. He's going to win a bigger share of the popular vote than any challenger since Roosevelt in 1932, challenger to incumbent. Democrats have now won the popular vote in 7 out of 8 presidential elections, which has never happened since the formation of the modern party system in 1828. So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why you can make a case that this is still not a winning hand over the long term for Republicans. But the most important thing that I think we have to keep in mind is this isn't static. Biden now is the president, and he has an opportunity to both chip away at the Trump constituencies and solidify the Democratic leaning constituencies. And so when we're talking about Hispanics and African Americans, a lot will depend on 2024 on what he is able to deliver for those communities. And the same thing, can he do a little better in the, Youngstowns of the world and the, in the Westmoreland counties of the world? Well, tell me what the world looks like in those places.
Well, yeah, and to state the obvious, who the candidates are, obviously in 2024, and the personal appeal that they have. Let's talk about younger voters a little bit, though. Yeah. You and I have been doing this. We're almost the same age, and so we have heard from progressives for our entire careers. We're just around the corner. Demographically, progressivism, democratic socialism, Bernie Sanders style government is coming to the United States, and single payer and a variety of other government programs, free college and other things. That hasn't happened yet. And yet we've been told for more than a generation that is what's coming. Are we at that place where in the next 10 years we are in fact going to end up in that direction, or is there something fundamental in the American electorate that's going to continue to be very cautious about that degree of progressivism?
Well, it does. I think more the latter, but there will be more. There is something to that theory, but there are limits to it. I mean, look, Generation Z and millennials are the most diverse generations ever, each one more diverse than the last. They're the best educated. They are the most tolerant on cultural issues. But they do not necessarily express enormous faith in big institutions of any kind in polling, which includes government. Biden won, depending on the poll, 60 to 62% of voters under 30, probably somewhere in the high 50s among people in their 30s, which are the oldest millennials. And look, that is an ominous signal for Republicans, because as I said, this year was the first time that millennials and Generation Z, people born after 1981, equaled people born before 64, the boomers and older, as a share of the eligible voters. The likelihood is that in 2024, they will equal them as a share of actual voters. And then beyond that, the lines just go like that. So doing it backwards. They get to be a lot bigger share. But, Donald Trump, I think in both of the major exit polls, won white voters under 30. I mean, he didn't win them by nearly as much as he won older white voters, but he won them. And so, no generation is completely immune, I think, to as a complete cliff from the overall attitudes of kind of the various groups. I mean, I'm sure Donald Trump, if we're looking at non-college whites under 30, I'm sure he did fine with them. I mean, I'm sure he won a lot of them. Probably, I bet he won 60% of them, at least. So I do think there is a tilt. I think that, it is a challenge for Republicans that particularly on cultural issues, if not necessarily the size and role of government, that these younger generations are in a very different place than they are. And again, that's why kind of Trump's shadow over the party is problematic, because I think large numbers of them view him as a racist who is essentially trying to hold them back And by the way, this will be a conflict with this court as it goes forward, because it's very hard to think of an issue on which the dominant opinion among millennials and Generation Z aligns with the cultural inclinations of the 6 Republicans on the court. But I having said that, I do think it's a problem. But yeah, it's not like a completely blank page, right? I mean, whites who are under 30 still are living around whites who are over 30, and they're not completely divorced from what has shaped this incredible consolidation behind Trump, particularly among whites without a college degree.
Immigration, obviously, huge issue in the last election, not certainly as much the focal point in this one. But I wonder what we're going to be seeing from a Biden administration, and let's say hypothetically that Republicans hold the Senate. What's going to happen for Dreamers? What about other sorts of deals that might be possible? What is there?
Well, administratively, I think he's going to reverse everything that can be reversed. I think all the enforcement, he's already said he's going to increase the number of refugees back to, I think, 150,000. I think, essentially, he will take the eraser to the blackboard on the Trump executive branch. What happens legislatively is a much bigger uncertainty. All of the Latino advocacy groups have gone to great length to insist that there was no diminution in support against, I think, the best evidence. I mean, they've produced their own polling that says, Biden won 70% of Latinos, and they were critical in Arizona and Nevada. But I think when you look at the precinct by precinct analysis, and certainly you can't ignore it in the Valley in Texas. I mean, something happened, and Trump did better after putting kids in cages and describing Mexicans as rapists and murderers, and telling members of Congress to go back, and being an openly racist, xenophobic, president. So I think that has to have implications for how far Democrats are willing to push this, especially if Republicans have the Senate. I mean, Biden promised, I think, day one, to introduce a comprehensive immigration reform plan. But if you were Nancy Pelosi and you couldn't get Democrats to even consider this in 2009 and 2010, this was not the election that would kind of set you up for the pathway to citizenship for 11 million people. I think there'll be a lot of Democrats who are kind of leery about that and will feel much more comfortable sticking to DACA. And even if it's a 50-50 Senate, I don't think they're going to be trying for the full scale. I would be surprised at that. I mean, and I know the advocacy groups kind of recognize the risk that they're in by how aggressively, and I think with limited evidence, they are pushing back at this argument that Trump did better among Latinos.
Ron, what about other legislative priorities of President-elect Biden? Again, and it all changes if Democrats take the Senate as well, but if Republicans win one of the two or both House Senate seats in Georgia, then is the House going to pass legislation that they know is DOA in the Senate to make a point, or are they going to be shy about passing a number of bills that they know aren't going to be taken up on the Senate floor?
Again, I think it is not a fully answered question, but I think they're going to be cautious. I mean, they passed a very ambitious agenda in 2019 and 2020. And it had some serious stuff in there: Medicare negotiation for prescription drugs, a new Voting Rights Act, HR 1, the comprehensive democracy reforms, universal background checks, DACA, the Pay Equity Act, protecting pre-existing conditions, infrastructure, and so forth. Republicans didn't run against that. They didn't run against what Democrats did in 2019 and 2020. They ran against what they might do someday in kind of the fondest wishes of the left side of their caucus. Single payer, Green New Deal, defund the police. So I don't know. I mean, I think the kind of things they did in 2019 and 2020, they will feel very comfortable doing again, and having Biden. We haven't had this alignment in a while with the House and the presidency together versus the Senate. I mean, maybe we had the opposite, the presidency and the Senate against the House with Reagan. But I think they would feel comfortable passing many of those same things again, and probably some of his climate agenda. and probably some of his healthcare agenda, and allowing him to then batter away at a Republican Senate as blocking it. Now, do they feel comfortable passing a 2035 clean energy standard in which all electricity generation must be from zero carbon sources by 2035? Do they feel comfortable passing an expanded public option as opposed to the Medicare negotiation of drugs and the expanded subsidies under the ACA? Do they feel comfortable passing, again, anything that's kind of on the vanguard that is going to be blocked in the Senate and could come back to be used against you? I don't know if they go that far, but I kind of doubt it.
All right. Ron, we have a number of questions from attendees of our event. Let me get right into them.
Sure.
Ronald asks, what was the impact of Kamala Harris being on the ticket?
Vice presidential, fingerprints on the outcomes are always pretty faint. Certainly, she was generated a lot of excitement among African-American women who are the most loyal Democratic constituency. But again, Trump ran better among Black voters than he did 4 years ago. And not only among men, according to the exit polls, again, the exit polls have issues, but according to the exit polls, he ran better among Black women as well. I think she helped with fundraising. I think she helped with energy. But I don't think she was a central, factor in this. Even Biden himself, mostly just focused on making himself acceptable as an alternative rather than really presenting a really sharp profile in contrast. So I think that the jury is out on her as a political actor, and whether if Biden cannot or will not run again in 2024, whether Democrats would feel comfortable with her as the nominee.
Interesting. So you don't think she is the heir apparent that she, if Biden decides not to seek a second term, you don't think it's almost automatic she would be the nominee?
So I think she's the heir apparent, and I do not think it's almost automatic that she would be the nominee, largely because of what happened in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. I mean, if Biden had won Wisconsin and Pennsylvania by 7 or 8 points, you'd say, well, sure, fine. Nominate Kamala Harris and really focus on burrowing deeper into Georgia, Arizona, and flipping North Carolina. But the fact that Joe Biden, Scranton Joe, middle-class Joe, 77-year-old white Catholic guy Joe, even he was only able to win Wisconsin by 20,000 votes and Pennsylvania by a point. Do you look at that and say automatically Kamala Harris can hold those states? I don't think you could plausibly conclude that or be certain of that. And so if you nominate her, you're making a bet that she can make the leap to the Sun Belt, effectively enough to offset the possible loss of both of those. Michigan's different, but the possible loss of both of those states. And I think there's going to be a real debate in the Democratic Party if he doesn't run, depending on what happens, about whether you can go that far in kind of leaping to your new coalition.
Okay. We have Larry asking, what role did COVID-19 play in all of this? And I'll just sort of tag on to his question. Let's pretend we were not in the middle of a pandemic. How do you think that might have affected the result?
The easy thing to say is that it doomed Trump. But the polling was not that different before it happened. It was not really any different. I mean, if you looked at some of the averages in 538 in Real Clear Politics, Biden's lead in October of 2019 was about the same as it was in October 2020, and the groups were dividing in largely the same way. As I said, the way it played out was kind of surprising and unpredictable, where it may have helped Biden, it may have helped Trump, in some of the minority communities that were hardest hit because they also worried about the economic side of it. But I do think that one argument that I think that is very important and is plausible to me is that there are pollsters on both sides who say that for a lot of these white collar voters, Trump's aberrations and his behavior were annoying, but not necessarily consequential initially. You could have said, I find him offensive. I don't like his tweeting. I think he's a racist. But what's the problem? The economy is great. My 401k is good. COVID did give a tangible consequence to Trump's kind of fundamental unseriousness about the job, and in that way probably locked in that opposition. So I think it did matter in that way, but I don't think the election would have been vastly different, if it had never happened.
We have one of our participants who asks, how would you suggest President-elect Biden deal with Trump? Does turn the other cheek work?
Boy, he's betting a lot that it does. And I think for Biden himself, yeah, I don't think the president, gets in a fight with the ex. I think he leaves that to others, to Kamala Harris and others. But I don't think you can ignore this. I mean, Donald Trump, as we said, added 10 million votes. You had 47% of the country that watched the last 4 years, that watched an openly racist and xenophobic, quasi-authoritarian leader who presided over the death of 250,000 people and said, sign me up for more of that. And, that is a real movement that is on the brink, until unless Biden can kind of expand his coalition, that is a movement that poses a genuine threat to kind of the norms of American democracy as we have known them, that is really on the brink of taking power at any given moment. And so I don't think you can allow it to just kind of, say, well, it's just a bunch of extremists over there and they're just people watching Fox. I think you need to figure out ways to kind of cut into that and to bring it back a little bit closer to where it was in 2018 or 2016, when it was more like 45%. 44% of the country. And so there's a real imperative for Biden not to deal with Trump, but to deal with Trump country, I think, and to find a way to talk to it a little bit more successfully than Democrats have done.
We have another question. What was the impact of defund the police and the growing profile of the squad? How did that affect the Democratic vote for Biden?
I don't think it affected the vote for Biden. I think it did affect them down ballot, as we were discussing. I mean, I think, as I said, Republicans were successful in making Democrats defend not what they had actually done in power in 2019 and 2020, but what the left of the party might someday do. And they've got to figure out some better answers to that. And that requires a certain amount of self-awareness on the part of the people from the safe districts. If they want to be in the majority, they need to figure out ways to kind of more, and you don't want to take away from them the right and even the imperative to kind of push the envelope, to push the party, but they need to find a way. I mean, Republicans are much more successful at this point about tarring Democrats with their most extreme elements than vice versa. Now we have this QAnon woman in Congress. We'll see if Democrats can kind of make that a symbol in some of these swing districts. But I think there's no question that there were voters who voted for Biden who said, I'm not on board with what Democrats might do, at least the kind of caricature of it that I am being presented.
Bruce asked, did the Lincoln Project, which was the group of Republicans who were against Trump's candidacy, did that make a significant difference?
I think it did. And I think all of the Republicans who endorsed Biden did. I mean, Biden ran ahead of the House Democrats. And as we're saying, there were definitely voters. I mean, the Lincoln Project was a rifle shot. I mean, they were, a lot of what they did was just to kind of stoke the psyche of, kind of Democrats and the media and Twitter. But to their actual electoral focus was a rifle shot on college-educated, white, Republican-leaning voters, especially men. And there's no question that Biden ran better among those voters than Clinton did. He ran better among those voters than House Democrats did. He ran better among those voters than Senate Democrats did. So I would say, yes, they had an impact.
Doug asks, how can we extrapolate from exit polls since the vast majority of people voted by mail? They weren't at the polls to interview upon exit.
Yeah, no, the exit polls, though, it's a misnomer at this point, because the exit poll includes a substantial traditional poll of people who voted by mail. So they tried to adapt for that. The problem is that the main exit poll, I mean, we now have two competing products, the AP Votecast and what we call the exit polls, which is done by Edison Research for a pool of a consortium of media organizations, including all the major television networks. And I love those guys. I have worked with them for 30 years, but there are serious problems with this year's exit poll. I mean, it has too few non-college whites in its sample. And as a result, all the numbers get kind of distorted. It had non-college whites as only 35% of the vote. They were probably like 42 or 43 when we get the more definitive numbers from the census. And because of that, everything gets just turned a little bit. For example, the exit poll had Trump winning college-educated white women, which is completely implausible. I mean, there's no way, not only because it doesn't fit with any of the AP Votecast or the Public Opinion Strategies election night poll, but also because you can't look Dane County and Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and Mecklenburg and Wake, and they would not have turned out the way they did, Gwinnett and Cobb, if Trump had won college-educated white women. So the exit polls tried to deal with the absentee balloting, but I think they have other issues this year.
Karen asks, so what would make polling more accurate if they're having a tough time talking to, getting enough of a particular demographic, so then they have to, mathematically, deal with that, and there's a lot of noise then in that. What's the way to fix it?
Obviously there are better professional pollsters than I who are grappling with this. Polling in 2018 was a lot more accurate than it was in 2016 or 2020. I think and as I said, polling in the Rust Belt both times was especially inaccurate. North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, it may have been slightly pro-Biden in the polling, Florida, but not as big an issue as in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and even Michigan, all of which were at least 5 or 6 points closer, 4 to 6 points closer than the polling had it. I just think there's a structural problem in that a lot of the Trump voters, the same people who will not tune into any mainstream news source, who consider kind of cultural institutions biased against them, who hate Hollywood, who hate the big universities, they will not participate in a poll for all the same reasons. And so I think pollsters are trying to figure out how to deal with that. It'll be interesting to see in 2022 without Trump on the ballot. My guess is polling does better again.
Harvey asks, if the news of a vaccine, Pfizer's announcement, had come the week before the election, do you think that would have had an effect on the outcome? I
suppose some, but I don't think significantly. I think, essentially college-educated white suburban America had decided, at least a majority of them, somewhere in the 54 or 55% range of them, had decided that Trump was unfit to be president. And I don't think a vaccine would have changed that. I think that, both his behavior, his cavalier and kind of chaotic attitude toward the pandemic, his open racism, the way he talked about women, I think all of those things, I think that was all the cement had hardened. And, I don't think he could have gotten any more turnout. I mean, I don't know how much more you could squeeze out of, his voters. So, and on balance, I don't think it would have changed the outcome.
Lauren asks, how do you explain a liberal state like California rejecting Proposition 16, which would have reversed Proposition 209 and restored affirmative action for state institutions?
Right. I was surprised by that. But I think it fits with everything else we're seeing, which is that the idea that there is a coherent political body that fits under the umbrella of people of color. We may have been ahead of our skis on that. That there are differences in all of these communities. I mean, that failed because it faced substantial resistance again, which was thought to have been largely ameliorated in different, certainly Asian American. I think you tell me, Larry, I mean, I haven't seen I don't remember the exit, but I think there was evidence that a lot of Hispanic voters and Black voters voted against it.
Yeah. It passed in LA County, but when you look at other parts of the state, it was clear that even non-white voters, and I think the supporters of it thought that was the slam dunk part of it. And it didn't prove
that's
to
what
be.
It changed. I mean, in the 90s, Asian Americans supported it in big numbers, but there was a thought that now, there was a thought, and I would confess that I am among those who thought this, that part of what had happened is that Asian Americans, Hispanics, and African Americans, who may have all had their differences among themselves, increasingly felt themselves part of one community that was under siege from a kind of nativist, racist movement within the Republican Party, and that therefore they were more willing to kind of lock arms together in defense. And we saw that in 2016. We saw that in 2018. We definitely did not see that in 2020.
I have another theory on that to add, and that is that, particularly for younger voters, I'm thinking of my son who's a college student, they see the diversity on campuses today. The California State University system is heavily Latino. Campuses like UCLA, USC are highly diverse. And so I think because of the ability of the UCs to use proxies like first in generation going to college, other ways of getting at diversity, which have added racial diversity, I think might have made this a tougher sell to younger voters than you might have anticipated.
Interesting. Look, I think, we are, the census will show that a majority of the under 18 population is non-white. A majority of the K-12 population is already in public schools is non-white. By 2023, a majority of the high school graduates will be non-white. And there is no question, the UC system is perhaps an exception to a degree, that the pinnacle of higher education remains preponderantly white, and that most of these kids of color are being channeled into the institutions with the least resources, the open access 4-year schools and the 2-year community colleges. That is just an unsustainable proposition. In virtually every state, not only is the share of white kids lower today than it was in 2000, there are fewer absolute white kids today than there were in 2000. I often tell business audiences when I talk to them, there is no cavalry of white kids coming to take your jobs and to fill those corner offices. So either you're gonna have a world in which this diminishing number of white kids monopolizes or predominates the highest ranked educational opportunities. I just don't think that's sustainable. And so if it's not affirmative action, finding something that can rectify that imbalance just seems to me one of the projects of the 2020s as we move toward inexorably becoming a true world nation and a majority minority country.
Ron, we're just about out of time. Just want to give you, we have about a minute to just sort of wrap up and give us a final thought on where we are and what we've seen over these past several weeks.
So a very prominent Democrat who is up to their eyeballs in policy said to me the other day, the most important thing for Joe Biden to do is to keep his popularity up and to position Democrats to hold the House in 2022 and to win the White House in 2024. She said, this person said to me, we now, and which I very much agree with, we now have a quasi-authoritarian nativist movement that is on the brink of taking power at any given moment. And you've seen even in the post-election period how much they're willing to kind of shred the norms of democracy, and that there is no policy goal for Democrats, a clean power standard, more electric charging vehicles, a public option that is as important as protecting the basic structure of democracy while trying to appeal to some of those voters and pull them away and ultimately force the Republican Party itself to pull away from the nihilistic vision that you are seeing in many ways from Trump. And I think that is the key for the next couple of years. Is there a way to preserve just the basic structures of our two-party democracy and the rule of law, and to make more people feel like they are part of the circle of opportunity, to walk us back from this brink of what I think is an 1850s level kind of a Cold War between the states?
Ron, thank you so much. It's been great to talk with you again. Terrific questions from those in the audience for this. And I now turn it over to community advocates, David Lehrer.
Thank you, Larry, and Ron, for an extraordinary conversation. Perfect questions, incisive and informative answers. We all learned a lot about the election, the changing electorate, and what is to come. A reminder, the next 5 weeks will be the same high caliber as tonight. We have an array of national analysts and opinion molders to offer more insight as to where our nation is headed. Next week, we have the incomparable George Will with Warren Olney interviewing, then Congressman Adam Schiff. The following week, our newest guest will be a man with an unmatched resume. He's been the Secretary of Defense, the head of the CIA, the White House Chief of Staff, Budget Director, and a congressman, Leon Panetta. His insights should be memorable. We close out the year with 2 special programs. One, a panel on civility and the future of civil rights with the national civil rights leaders and the heads of the NAACP, the Anti-Defamation League, the Latinos United, and the Asian Pacific Islander Health Forum. Then on December 23rd, the New York Times Pulitzer Prize winning Bret Stephens will bring our programming a year to a close. We hope that you will continue to have us on your calendar for every Wednesday evening at 5 Pacific. Thank you for spending the evening with us. We'll see you next week. Stay safe and healthy.